Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Nikki Newman never imagined that the quiet drive meant to clear her head would turn into a nightmare that dragged her back into the darkest chapter of her life. Yet as the cold metal door slammed shut behind her and the echo reverberated through the abandoned lake house, she realized with chilling clarity that Matt had planned this moment far longer than anyone suspected. Because what began as a casual request for a private conversation quickly revealed itself to be a meticulously orchestrated trap, one designed not only to imprison her body but to strip her of the hard-won sobriety that had defined her fight for survival. And as Nikki stood trembling in the dimly lit room, her eyes darting toward the locked windows and the faint smell of alcohol lingering in the air, Matt stepped forward with a twisted smile that spoke volumes about the resentment he had carried for years. Resentment fueled by Victor Newman's power, Nikki's resilience, and a life Matt believed had cheated him at every turn. And when he poured a drink slowly, deliberately, letting the amber liquid splash against the glass, Nikki's breath caught in her throat because she knew exactly what he was doing, knew that this was not about revenge alone but about breaking her spirit by resurrecting the monster she had spent decades trying to bury. And as Matt spoke in a low, mocking tone about how people never really change, Nikki felt her confidence falter. Flashes of Genoa City blurring with memories of rock bottom, empty bottles, shame and regret, memories she had confronted and conquered with unimaginable strength. Yet now those memories clawed their way back as Matt placed the glass within inches of her hand and whispered that Victor wasn't coming, that no one even knew where she was, and that the world would simply assume Nikki Newman had fallen off the wagon again, because that was the cruel genius of Matt's plan, to make her downfall believable. To erase her progress by exploiting the very stigma she had fought to overcome. And as the hours passed, Nikki's captivity became psychological torture, with Matt alternating between feigned concern and outright cruelty, recounting every public relapse, every whispered judgment, every moment she had been underestimated, until Nikki's resolve wavered and tears streamed down her face, not from weakness but from the exhaustion of constantly having to prove she was more than her past. And when her hands shook uncontrollably and she collapsed onto the couch, Matt saw his victory within reach. Yet what he failed to understand was that Nikki Newman's true strength had never come from pretending she was cured but from acknowledging her vulnerability and choosing to fight anyway. And as she stared at the untouched glass, she spoke with a raw honesty that stunned even Matt, admitting that yes, the urge was real, yes, the disease never truly disappeared, but that surrendering now would mean letting Matt define her story. And she would rather die than give him that power. And meanwhile in Genoa City, Victor Newman felt an unshakable sense of dread gnawing at him, a feeling that something was terribly wrong despite Nikki's silence. And when Phyllis mentioned seeing Matt lingering near the Newman ranch earlier that week, Victor's instincts exploded into fury as pieces fell into place, prompting him to launch an all-out search that shook the city, pulling strings, making threats, and unleashing the ruthless protector that had made him feared for decades. While Jack Abbott grew uneasy knowing Nikki's disappearance would inevitably ignite old rivalries, yet even Jack couldn't deny that Nikki was the heart of Genoa City, and her absence sent ripples of fear through every household. And back at the lake house, Matt's patience wore thin as Nikki refused to drink, leading him to lash out, shattering the glass against the wall and revealing the unstable desperation beneath his controlled facade. And in that moment Nikki saw the truth. Matt was unraveling, his obsession with control masking his own failures. And when he turned away to pour another drink, Nikki seized her chance, locking herself in the bedroom, barricading the door, and screaming for help until her voice cracked, unaware that Victor's men were already closing in. And as sirens pierced the night and Matt realized the game was over, he attempted one final act of manipulation, shouting that Nikki would never escape her addiction, that she would always be broken. But as the door burst open and Victor rushed to her side, Nikki stood tall despite her shaking body, declaring with fierce clarity that her disease did not define her. Her captivity did not erase her progress, and her survival was the greatest proof of all. And as Matt was dragged away screaming, the aftermath settled in with brutal honesty, because Nikki's rescue did not magically erase the trauma. And in the days that followed, she made the courageous decision to recommit to her recovery publicly, refusing to hide, refusing to be ashamed, standing before her family in Genoa City to admit that the urge had returned but that admitting it was not failure. And as Victor held her hand with rare vulnerability, viewers were reminded that the young and the restless thrives not just on scandal and shock but on stories of resilience, and Nikki Newman's captivity became more than a crime. It became a powerful reckoning, a reminder that recovery is a lifelong battle, that villains don't always win, and that even when darkness tries to reclaim what it once destroyed, strength, love and truth can still break free, leaving Genoa City forever changed by a woman who refused to let her past become her prison again. In the days following Nikki Newman's rescue, Genoa City did not return to normal so much as it held its breath, because while the police statements were filed and Matt was formally charged, the emotional damage left behind refused to stay contained within court documents or press releases, and Nikki herself discovered that freedom did not immediately feel like safety, as every quiet moment echoed with the sound of a door slamming shut and every glass on a table, whether filled with water or wine, seemed to pulse with accusation, reminding her that captivity had not only tested her sobriety but had peeled back layers of trauma she believed she had already healed. And when she woke in the middle of the night gasping for air with Victor gripping her hand in panic, it became painfully clear that surviving Matt had reignited the war inside her, a war she had never truly won but had learned to manage with discipline, honesty, and humility, yet now that discipline felt fragile, as though Matt's words had planted a seed of doubt she could not easily silence, because no matter how strong Nikki appeared to the outside world, she could not deny that for one terrifying moment she had wanted the drink, not because she was weak but because addiction is patient and cruel, waiting for fear, isolation, and despair to reopen the door, and as Victor demanded that she rest and recover in the safety of the ranch, Nikki instead insisted on facing the world, knowing that hiding would only feed the shame Matt had tried to weaponize against her, and so she made the difficult choice to return to a meeting, walking into the familiar room with trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, where she confessed not only her captivity but the resurgence of cravings that followed, admitting she was angry at herself for still being vulnerable after all these years, only to be reminded by those around her that vulnerability was not failure but proof that she was alive and fighting. And while Nikki sought healing, Matt sat alone in a cold holding cell, his arrogance dissolving into bitterness as he replayed every moment he believed he had been in control, only to realize that the real reason he targeted Nikki was not Victor or power or revenge but his own inability to accept responsibility for his choices. And when his lawyer warned him that public sympathy would be non-existent given Nikki's history and status, Matt lashed out, blaming the media, blaming Victor, blaming Nikki for surviving him, yet deep down he knew the truth. He had underestimated her, and worse, he had exposed himself as a man terrified of irrelevance. And as the news broke across Genoa City, reactions were swift and divided, with some whispering cruelly that Nikki had been tempted again, while others rallied fiercely around her, including Victoria, who confronted Victor with raw honesty about the cost of constant war, reminding him that Nikki's life had nearly been destroyed not just by Matt but by the long shadows cast by Victor's enemies, forcing Victor to face the uncomfortable reality that his power often came with collateral damage. And this reckoning hit hardest when Nikki, standing in the living room with the strength of someone who had stared into the abyss and refused to jump, told Victor she needed space. Not distance from him, but space from the suffocating protection that made her feel like a victim rather than a survivor. And that declaration shook Victor to his core, because it was one thing to rescue Nikki, but another entirely to accept that loving her meant trusting her strength even when it frightened him. And as the weeks unfolded, the legal case against Matt became a spectacle, with prosecutors laying out the calculated cruelty of his plan to force a relapse narrative, exposing how he had stocked the lake house with alcohol, isolated Nikki, and documented her captivity in a twisted attempt to destroy her credibility. And when Nikki was called to testify, the courtroom fell silent as she took the stand, refusing to allow fear or shame to silence her, speaking openly about addiction not as a moral failure but as a disease that Matt had attempted to exploit. And her testimony struck a nerve far beyond the courtroom, igniting conversations throughout Genoa City and beyond about recovery, accountability, and the cruelty of stigma, while Matt sat stone-faced, his attempts to intimidate her crumbling as Nikki looked directly at him and calmly stated that he had not broken her, that he had only proven how desperately she deserved to keep fighting for herself. And though the verdict would come later, the damage to Matt's reputation was immediate and irreversible. And yet even as justice seemed within reach, Nikki's internal struggle intensified, because trauma does not obey timelines, and there were moments when the urge returned uninvited, moments when she felt exhausted by the idea of having to be vigilant forever. And in one quiet, devastating scene, Nikki stood alone in the kitchen late at night, staring at a bottle of wine Victor had forgotten to lock away, her hand hovering as tears streamed down her face, not out of desire but out of grief for the version of herself who would always have to fight harder than others just to feel normal. And in that moment she did something revolutionary. She called for help, waking Victor, admitting the temptation without shame, and that simple act marked a turning point not only in her recovery, but in their marriage, as Victor realized that strength was not about control but about listening, and together they poured the bottle down the drain, the sound echoing like a quiet victory. And as Genoa City watched Nikki reclaim her narrative, the aftermath rippled outward, forcing characters across the canvas to confront their own demons, their own denial, and their own definitions of strength, because Nikki's story was never about captivity alone but about the truth that healing is nonlinear, courage is choosing honesty over pride, and survival does not mean pretending the darkness no longer exists. And as the season built toward its climax, viewers were left with an image that would linger long after the credits rolled. Nikki Newman standing in the sunlight, scars exposed but unashamed, refusing to let anyone, including herself, reduce her to her worst moments, proving once again why The Young and the Restless remains a story not just of scandal and power but of resilience, redemption, and the relentless fight to remain standing, even when the past reaches out and tries to pull you back into the shadows. As Genoa City moved closer to Matt's sentencing, the illusion that the worst was overshadowed for Nikki Newman, because while the public saw a survivor standing tall and the press hailed her testimony as courageous, the private cost of reliving her captivity again and again began to erode the fragile calm she had rebuilt, and Nikki found herself wrestling not only with memories but with a deep, simmering anger she had buried for years. Anger at Matt for exploiting her disease, anger at the world for never fully letting her escape her past, and anger at herself for still feeling tempted by something she had sworn would never control her again. And that anger manifested in restless nights, sharp words, and moments of terrifying isolation when even Victor's presence felt overwhelming, as if love itself had become another pressure she was afraid of failing, and Victor, for all his power and certainty, struggled to understand how to help a woman who did not need rescuing so much as space to feel her pain without being judged. And this disconnect came to a head when Victor arranged a private security detail without telling her, triggering a visceral panic response that sent Nikki spiraling back to the lake house in her mind, causing her to collapse in tears as she demanded to be seen not as a fragile liability but as a woman capable of choosing her own path. And though Victor apologized, the damage lingered, exposing the truth that trauma does not simply fade when the danger ends, it reshapes trust. And as Nikki attempted to regain control by throwing herself into charity work and public appearances, the cracks only widened, because every microphone, every whispered rumor, every sideways glance reminded her that the world would always be waiting for her to fail. And in the midst of this pressure, Matt, now stripped of bravado and facing the full weight of the law, made one final, desperate move from behind bars, leaking a statement through his attorney, suggesting that Nikki had exaggerated her captivity and implying that her history made her an unreliable narrator. And though the claim was swiftly condemned, its impact on Nikki was devastating, because it reopened the wound Matt had carved so carefully, the fear that no matter how hard she fought, addiction would always be used to silence her truth. And when Nikki learned of the statement, she did not explode in anger but went eerily quiet, withdrawing from Victor, skipping meetings, and convincing herself she could handle the storm alone. And that isolation proved dangerous, because addiction thrives in secrecy. And one night, after a brutal argument with Victor in which he accused her of pushing him away and she accused him of trying to control her recovery, Nikki left the ranch and drove aimlessly through Genoa City, haunted by the sense that she no longer belonged anywhere. And when she stopped at a quiet bar on the edge of town, not to drink, she told herself, but just to sit, just to feel anonymous, the line she had sworn never to cross blurred with terrifying speed. As the bartender asked what she wanted and Nikki hesitated long enough for the old reflex to awaken, her heart pounding as memories of relief and ruin collided inside her chest. And in that suspended moment, Nikki confronted the truest horror of addiction. Not the act of drinking itself but the seductive lie that one moment of escape could erase the pain. And though she ordered a soda, the shame of being there at all overwhelmed her, sending her fleeing back into the night, shaking and sobbing in her car as she finally admitted the truth she had been avoiding. Matt hadn't just traumatized her, He had destabilized her recovery, and pretending otherwise was only pushing her closer to the edge, and this realization forced Nikki to make the most difficult decision of her life, not to relapse but to step back, publicly and privately, from the image of perfection she had been clinging to, and when she told Victor she needed to enter an intensive recovery retreat temporarily, not because she had failed but because she refused to wait until she did, Victor was stunned, his instincts screaming to fight, to fix, to keep her close, yet this time he listened, understanding that loving Nikki meant trusting her choices even when they frightened him, and as Nikki left Genoa City for treatment, the town buzzed with speculation, some cruel, some compassionate, but Nikki refused to respond, focusing instead on confronting the truth of her disease in a raw, unfiltered environment where titles meant nothing and honesty was survival. And while Nikki fought her internal war, Matt's sentencing arrived, and the courtroom filled with tension as Victor sat stone-faced and Nikki's absence loomed like a silent accusation. And when the judge detailed Matt's crimes, the calculated manipulation, the psychological torture, the exploitation of addiction, the illusion of Matt as a misunderstood victim collapsed entirely, culminating in a sentence that ensured he would never again have the power to harm Nikki or anyone else. And though Matt attempted one last outburst, shouting that Nikki would never truly escape herself, his words rang hollow, because the real battle was no longer between captor and captive but between Nikki and the fear that she would always be defined by her weakest moments. And weeks later, when Nikki returned to Genoa City changed, not cured, not flawless but grounded in a renewed commitment to truth, the reunion with Victor was quiet and profound, marked not by dramatic declarations but by mutual respect. And as Nikki stood once more in the Newman living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, she acknowledged that the road ahead would always require vigilance, humility, and courage, but that she would no longer allow anyone to use her disease as a weapon against her. And in that declaration lay the true climax of the story, because Nikki Newman's journey was never about proving she was invincible but about proving she was human, worthy, and strong enough to keep choosing life even when the darkness returned. And as Genoa City absorbed the impact of her resilience, viewers were left with a powerful truth that echoed beyond the screen, that recovery is not a straight line, survival is an act of defiance, and sometimes the greatest victory is not avoiding the fall but standing up again with honesty, dignity, and the unshakable belief that your past does not get to decide your future. Even after Matt was sentenced and locked away, Nikki Newman discovered that freedom was not as simple as opening the door and stepping outside, because the trauma of captivity left invisible chains, each memory of isolation and manipulation replaying in her mind when she least expected it. And as she walked through the familiar halls of the Newman ranch, Victor's presence both comforted and unsettled her, reminding her of the paradox of love and protection, that being cared for so deeply could sometimes feel like a cage of its own, and yet she needed him more than ever, not as a savior but as a partner who could witness her truth without judgment. And in these quiet, tense moments, Nikki confronted the most frightening realization of all, that Matt's influence, though physically gone, had planted seeds of doubt in her psyche, a whispering fear that her sobriety could falter at any time, that one misstep might allow the past to define her again. And when Victor suggested they resume their public appearances to restore normalcy, Nikki hesitated, feeling the weight of Genoa City's expectations pressing down, the subtle glances, the murmurs, the unspoken assumption that she should perform perfection. And it was then that Nikki made a choice both terrifying and empowering, deciding to speak openly at a community recovery event, confessing that trauma could return even after years of strength, that temptation and fear were part of her reality, and that acknowledging them was not weakness but the only path to genuine resilience. And as she shared her story, the room erupted in quiet respect and emotion, listeners moved by her honesty and courage, proving that her battle extended beyond herself to inspire others confronting similar demons. And back at the ranch that evening, as Victor held her hand in a silent show of solidarity, Nikki felt the faintest stirrings of hope, understanding that the future would not be defined by the shadow of Matt's cruelty but by the choices she made every day, that recovery was a lifelong journey, that love and trust required patience and vulnerability, and that her strength lay not in denial of her struggles but in the bravery of facing them. And as Genoa City slowly absorbed the shockwaves of the events that had unfolded, the captivity, the trial, the near relapse, and the public reckoning, everyone realized that Nikki Newman had not only survived, but had transformed her pain into a testament of resilience, leaving the City, the viewers, and even Victor with the sobering truth that the battles we fight internally often resonate louder than any external enemy, and that sometimes the most dramatic heroism is choosing honesty, confronting fear, and refusing to let trauma dictate who we are or who we can become.